I think we're live. We think we're live. We're not entirely sure. We're having an issue here. So it's been a morning. We're just gonna talk and then we're gonna go from there. So Erica, let's talk about the tech in your house today. What's happening?
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh, you guys. So one of the things that so my son passed away 1 year ago today. I think that's kind
Yes.
of the big weight, at least on my mind, as we were thinking about even, do we have a stream today?
Yeah.
And one of the things that, Lindsay and I had talked about was like, you know what? At least for me, there's a lot of grace and a lot of forgiveness should I not want to show up. But when we were having the conversation, at least for the way that I've coped in a lot of ways, I tend to just look at the thing that scares me and I try to just look at it head on. And so that was a little bit of how I approached the conversation today was, do I show up? Is this okay to do today? Is this something that's going to support me as well?
Yeah.
And start there. And so in the spirit of looking at it head on and the things that scare me head on, uh, that's we're here. We're showing up today. So being that it is such a interesting anniversary in our household, we started the morning by having our nurses come over, which we do every Friday morning. The nurses and therapists that worked with my son are invited over for a kind of coffee hour every Friday, and they can come have coffee with us and we just sit and catch up in our family room. So we had everyone over this morning, and as we're sitting there, we hear this strange beeping going on. And it was bizarre because we're like, where is that coming from? And come to find out, it's a little timer, a kitchen timer in a backpack that was just randomly getting pressed with the button to go off. And there wasn't an alarm going off. It was just the beep randomly going off. So when my son has made himself known, at least how we've thought about it, it's electronic things that really
Yeah.
seem to come through. And so as we're all sitting there having our coffee like we would every other Friday morning, this little alarm is beeping in the corner of the kitchen, unprovoked, in a backpack it's been in all night without beeping. And and so that was our little sign this morning that he was sitting there having coffee with us. And
I
then
love
when I
that.
went in here to sign in, it felt like nothing wanted to work. My camera didn't want to connect. My sound wasn't connecting. I had to
Yeah.
restart my computer. I had to restart and log in my browser. So
It's
thanks everybody for your patience as I'm trying to figure out the electronics today because there's a vibe going on for the day for
there's
sure.
100%. Yeah, I feel like that a lot with Rona.
Yeah.
And I uh, like signs are such a thing, right?
Yeah.
It's such a it's such a relevant topic, and I'm holding space for you and your family today.
Thank you.
Um, and I
Appreciate it.
also know that sometimes these days aren't the worst ones. So, hold space for you every day, honestly.
Thank you. We'll
Yeah.
really appreciate that as always. Well,
Yeah.
today, I mean, we really, in the spirit of leaning into that, Lindsay and I, as we were prepping for this episode, we were thinking about, where do we want to focus? How do we honor the reality of the day and the weight of the day in the talk and the conversation? And, um, and so I know one of the things we wanted to just do head on was really talk about the experience of death and dying in healthcare as a system, right? And from that executive strategist perspective, how does our willingness as an industry to talk about topics like that or not talk about them, how does that impact the strategies that we develop? Because um, we can't avoid death and dying in a
Yeah.
conversation around healthcare strategy. It's an essential part of that experience.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. So I think in preparation for the conversation, I was looking up some information because I think there's two parts to this. There's the human piece of like when we avoid hard conversations when we're not talking about potential outcomes, a few things happen in my mind. One, we anchor on hope that may be false hope, and that can be equally as damaging as hope as just being honest. And I think like study after study shows that that families, patients, including in pediatric settings, prefer clear communication around outcomes. The other piece of it for me, I think, is there's a business aspect to this too. And when we
Mhm.
think about the weight of the healthcare system, and it turns out one of the stats that gets thrown around all the time 80% of healthcare costs happen in the last 6 months of life is not actually true. No one can find, okay, no one can find a citation. And by no one, I mean Google or AI agents were unable to find a citation for me. So if someone has it, I'd love to see it. But I did find things like around 25% of Medicaid and Medicare costs in the last year of life. And so like we don't want to talk about like business, but we are talking about healthcare. We're talking about that aspect of it. And so I think there's two or more parts, frankly, for me on this topic. Where should we
Yeah.
get started?
Why I guess maybe, like, why do you think, Lindsay, why do you think people avoid the topic? Is it just because it makes them uncomfortable, or is it just more complicated, or, like, why do we not talk about it more?
Okay. I have my own thoughts on this.
I wanna know. What are they?
Obviously, so we're doing this conversation, right? Okay, so I read a book after Rona died, that was written by a rabbi, and he said something that really stuck with me, which is that in general, people who are really close to death are not as afraid of dying as people who are not dying. So it's if you're afraid of dying, congrats, you're not likely dying. And I think there's truth to that, right? Like it's like this, it's the one inevitable in life. We're born and then we die, right? And those things happen in some order. And I always say, I know the saying is there's three guarantees in life. You're born, you die, and you pay taxes. And I always add, like, if you're old enough, you'll pay taxes. If you're old enough at the time you die, you will pay taxes. Um, and so
What
for
a
me,
humbling comment. I love that, Lindsay. That's so good.
it's true. Like,
It is true, though.
I
Yeah.
tried to remind myself of that every April 15th. Like, I'm old enough and I have lived long enough that I will be paying taxes this year. No, I think so. I think we're afraid of the finality, and I think part of it is the unknown, right? The unknown of what actually comes, and I think even if you're ha have, like, a strong faith, there's still an element of unknown, and there's still an element of, like, needing to trust that there's something beyond this, and so
Yeah.
there's the piece of it of, like of the unknown. I think too, in this country in particular, though elsewhere too, there's that element of, like, personal responsibility. And I do think we anchor on that so heavily of like, well, so if someone's like, "Oh, I have cancer." Like, "Well, did you eat organic? Were you a smoker?" The kinds of questions that you get. I mean, for me, it was like, well, it was genetic, right? And when I say like, no, people are like, "What?" So I think there's the what did you do to deserve this? Because something so horrible can't happen. I also think it's the only way we can justify our healthcare system is by making it about personal responsibility. Because otherwise, why are you people go bankrupt over something that's a little bit random. So there's a challenge there too. Um, and so I think there's the unknowingness. There is the feeling of failure when that comes with death in a way. Um, I know my TEDx is coming out at any moment. I'm a little terrified, but I talk a lot about the guilt and like the feeling that I had failed, which is the most insane thing, right? Like I
Yeah.
donated cells 4 times, which is I was told unethical, unethical potentially. Like I didn't sleep for 4.5 months. I did everything I could. I moved mountains, and still I felt like it was my fault. It was my fault what happened. Um, so for me, I feel like there are a lot of different elements to this. I'm going down rabbit holes here, but
No,
so
but
I
you're
think,
yeah.
yeah, like I think there's just there's a lot wrapped up in it. It's a complicated set of emotions that comes with death, and there's a lack of acceptance.
Yeah.
Even the phrase "lost their battle" makes me want to rip things. Like I just want to because I think about it and I'm like that phrase implies someone could have done more, right? Like,
Yeah.
well, if they could have maneuvered better. Um, and we're all in the same race.
Well, and you're right, like, the rhetoric around how we talk about death, I think, publicly is a
Yeah.
little bit distorted from the real experience of it.
Yeah.
'Cause I do also struggle with the phrase of battle, right? Just that cancer is somehow a battle or a war to be won,
Yes.
when it's about, like, my experience, and I don't know if this is the right analogy, but it's actually more like surfing in my experience than it
Oh,
is
interesting.
like a battle. Like, you can't fight the ocean, you know? Like,
Yeah,
those
yeah.
are circumstances that you are completely victim to, point blank over. You are a victim to it.
Mhm.
You're not a bad person either for recognizing the victimhood in that.
Yep.
Um, when I think about our experience with cancer, I think about something like surfing more, that you've got waves coming in some cases, these waves can be huge, and they
Yeah.
could just eat you up. Um, and one of the things that at least I tried to think about when I was, supporting my son in that journey was that, let's try to ride that wave. If it's going to be coming at us and we know it's coming and we have to deal with that wave one way or the other, how can we
Mhm.
make the most out of that wave? Like, we can absolutely let
Yes.
that wave just run us over, and we're upside down getting tore up by coral. There's a reality to
Yes.
that, especially if we try to fight the wave itself. But if we can see the wave, recognize that it's there, that it's coming, and we can position ourselves to maybe get the most out of it,
Yep.
then, I think that was how we metaphorically tackled recurrences, especially too. After that first
Interesting.
wave came through, and we're like, all right, crap, we're going to have to face this again, and then again and again.
Yeah.
How do we navigate that? And I think we were pretty good surfers in our journey. But
Yeah.
at some point too, you're again, you have to be humbled. And in our case, my son, in following the metaphor to its extent, right? The ocean drowned him. He eventually succumbed to the waves, and he couldn't fight the waves. It was not possible to fight the waves. And
Yeah.
the circumstances, whether it was the size of the waves or the depth of the ocean or whatever it was, the rip current, whatever things or forces were at play in our experience of the ocean,
Yeah.
we weren't able to get out. And that was just a reality of it. And but I don't think of it as a battle lost, right? It's just like such a weird metaphor to compare it to war.
Yeah. Yeah. It's also it's such a human thing.
Yeah.
Like, arguably, it's the most human thing that we'll ever do. And I think I don't know, like, I wonder if like, amending my previous statement, if part of the resistance to it is just, like, the growth in technology, the growth in treatments, the growth in all of those things, like, we take the humanity out a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, I did a thing this week, where I was talking about rethinking informed consent, and one of the things I kept coming back to is, like, three key takeaways. So inform instead of disclose, because right now we treat it like a legal disclosure. It's not an informative process,
We
it's a
said
legal
that. We
disclosure.
said it. We told them.
I was like, "Listen, I know it's not supposed to be I didn't say this week, I've said this elsewhere. I know it's not supposed to be a contract, but it is, for all intents and purposes, a contract, and that is how we treat it, and that's why lawyers get to dictate what goes in it and how it is written and all of those things."
Yeah.
Um, there was a really good presentation from someone, from WCG about things that we can do to, like, make the form better, so people should check it out. The other thing is, to think beyond the form, because we're having a really human moment. Like, think about who's in the room, who's having the conversation. And for me, I think this is why I'm obsessed with palliative care doctors. Obsessed with
Oh
them.
my gosh, they're my favorite. In
Yeah,
a
and it's
weird,
because
like,
they
it's
spend
like
a
a
year.
specialist. It's
But
your palliative care. Oh,
it's
it's
because they
big
spend a
girl.
year learning how to communicate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, for me, like, that's the piece, right? It's just this communication, this, like, this humanness, human piece of it. Um, but I do think that, if we're really gonna tackle I'm gonna pivot to research for a second, because for me, it comes out in the industry a lot. I think it comes out in how we position trials.
Yeah.
I think, um, before my experience with Rona, when I was doing recruitment, I would be, like, so annoyed every time a compliance lead was like, "You cannot say potential cure," but now I get it. Because so many trials, the actual endpoint is not curative. The endpoint is like 6 months of disease-free survival, or it is or less in some instances. And so when we're anchoring on when people say, "Is there a clinical trial?" They're not thinking like, "Do I get 6 more weeks? And might those 6 weeks be not fantastic?" They're thinking, "Do I am I able to, get to the place where I am, uh, having my life and having a good life. And so I think really like aligning our definitions of, and I think that's why the alignment on endpoints matters a lot.
Mhm.
Um, so for me, that's part of it. And then the other piece of it is it's really thinking about how we preserve quality of life in a protocol format so that it's consistent across sites and not something that's just like, oh, well, this hospital has a child life team or has a good palliative team and this hospital does not. And how do we really clearly articulate off ramps so that if the time comes for someone to transition more towards end of life care and they're transitioning potentially off of a study drug as part of that, how do we make it clear to the family that that's what's happening?
Mm. I struggle with clinical trials. Maybe you can humble me a little bit. Like our experience, we
Yes.
never actually participated in one. But when I think about like the whole journey and like our
Yeah.
whole journey and when clinical trials became a relevant part of the conversation. Because out of the
Yes.
gate at diagnosis, they're not on the radar. They're not a
Yeah.
conversation. And you can have that like inquiry, but your clinical team broadly, keep me humble and honest here, but broadly clinical teams are going to look at the standard of care before they're even going to have a conversation about a trial.
Yeah.
We're gonna say, "Let's do the things that we know can have an impact," and, even if it's a minor impact and the standard of care doesn't really guarantee a whole lot, they'll
Yeah.
still exhaust that first. That has to be done.
Yeah.
And then once that's exhausted, then you're in this kinda no man's land where clinical trials become something you can have a meaningful conversation around. But, I mean, real talk, clinical trials are not designed to improve access to treatments for patients in the function of the trial. We
Yeah.
do have to make trials available because it's an important part, and we have to engage people meaningfully in the trial process to get the results that we need to then bring something to market. But the trial itself functionally is not designed to support a patient's experience.
It is
And
not.
I might be saying some, like, fighting words out here for my
No,
clinical
I think
trial
this is actually going to be a good conversation because you and I had very different experiences where
Yeah.
our treatment journey looked like we first got received a diagnosis of moderate aplastic anemia, which is treated with at-home immune suppression, which is what we did. But
Yeah.
then within 2 weeks, she was reclassified as very severe because she got an infection and we lost all of her cell lines.
Mm,
And so for us from the beginning, because we knew that she had no matches on the registry, our options were there were three. It it was an immune suppression in hospital that would later complicate and reduce chance of survival in a transplant setting,
okay.
which was sort of like became the runner up. There was a type of transplant that had a really high rate of complications, including like very severe, painful things that often lead to death, which didn't really feel like a good option to us. And then the third was a clinical trial. And so for us from the beginning, the conversation was a clinical trial. But the conversation that I had between with her provider, so they had two people in the room. One was playing the pro transplant trial role, and the other one was playing devil's advocate. Um,
Mhm,
and I looked at the person playing devil's advocate, and I said, "Is there anything in the pipeline?" And he
mhm,
said, "Not for her." And so it really became one option. And then at the end of the day, and I think this goes back to the conversation about guilt, there are the disease will dictate the treatment eventually.
yeah,
And so we all think we're in control, but actually we're generally not. And the disease is going to dictate the path that we have to take. So we had to move and we had to move quickly. And then we had to just keep kind of going on those paths. Um, and I think I agree the purpose of research is to answer a scientific question, but also right now and increasingly it is about getting access to a treatment and it is being positioned as access to a treatment. And if you think about N of one, if you think about many of the rare disease treatments that are coming out are getting approved in a phase 2b, right? So there's going to be an element of observational research that happens as part of that just to ensure safety and efficacy over time. But people generally are going to join a trial for, if it's a critical illness, for an access to a treatment. And we saw that happen with oncology when I first started in this field like 10 years ago when immune therapy was just coming out.
yeah.
Um, so I I agree that's not the actual intent of research, but I think increasingly it is becoming how it is positioned. And there's this ethical thing here that we need to decide if we're going to tackle it as an industry or not.
Yeah. Our journey with clinical trials, I think, we might have talked about this before, Lindsay, but for the sake of our audience here, one of the things that we encountered, we never actually did a trial. We definitely explored some options there, but after we had exhausted the standard of care for us, which the standard of care for anaplastic ependymoma, which is the type of cancer my son had,
Yeah.
the standard of care calls for total resection via surgical means, and then followed by proton radiation to the area that originally had the tumor
Mhm.
touching it. So, for example, if you had a big tumor in your brain, they remove the tumor in its entirety. Well, now your brain has kind of like a gap that then closes back in because it's reorienting back into the way that it should be there. But
Mhm.
the whatever space that tumor originally occupied is what gets radiated. So if you have something like your cerebellum that gets pushed up out of the way from the tumor and then comes back into that space,
Yeah.
the process and protocol for radiation means that if it was in that space three-dimensionally, it's now getting radiated. So in my son's case, it meant,
Interesting.
the cerebellum, which was originally pushed out, now is occupying the space that got radiated. So that
Okay.
was an interesting kind of nuance in the journey itself. But when it came to the clinical trials, after we had exhausted all of those things, my son had a lot of collateral damage from surgeries, from
Oh,
chemo,
yeah.
from the treatment, from the radiation itself. One of which was a complication from vagus nerve trauma, which in your vagus nerve is a
Yeah.
major nerve cluster. For some of you, maybe less familiar, it connects effectively your brain and your gut. They talk about it as like the brain gut axis of the body. And with the location of the tumor my son had, it was on the brainstem, which is like the starting point of this vagus nerve down to your gut. So the vagus nerve trauma that he had created one of the complications that expressed itself symptomatically was something called cyclic vomiting syndrome, and it's kind of a lesser known phenomena, but it's effectively a migraine of your GI tract. So instead of getting a headache like some people might get, in my son's case, he would have a trigger in his life, maybe stress, maybe food, maybe sleep, could be lots of different
Mhm.
things. But it would trigger his body to have this GI migraine, which meant that he started vomiting and he would throw up incessantly until pretty much he would exhaust himself. So inevitably, every single time this spiral started, we'd wind up inpatient for 2 weeks. Well, we later discovered through some trial and error and then, research outside the standard of care that things like THC and CBD can actually be really effective at
Yep.
managing vagus nerve trauma specifically. So we use that also as a kind of adjunctive therapy to the chemotherapy and treatment regimen that we had him on. But we then discovered that it was actually really effective at managing cyclic vomiting syndrome. So effective that he went from, a 2 week hospitalization every other month, which is a pretty big tax on a
That's a lot.
family
Yeah, that's a
for over
lot.
a course of, a year or two, to not a single episode. He didn't have a single episode the rest of his life from cyclic vomiting syndrome
It's
after he started
amazing.
regularly taking the THC and CBD that we
Yeah.
got access to through the compassionate use registry in Texas. And so that was really striking to me. So when we then faced a recurrence and we had clinical trials on the table, and this is coming back to where I also have the opinion that they're not necessarily designed for the clinical outcomes per se, they're
Right.
designed for scientific research and
Yeah, of
study.
course. It's to answer a scientific question.
Correct. So
Yeah.
the clinical trials across the board said, if there is cannabis, medical cannabis used, that must be discontinued and washed out before you can be eligible for the trial. And in my son's case, that was something we couldn't, to preserve quality of life for him and our family, we couldn't physically discontinue that for him because we had seen so much success on the therapeutic benefit.
Yeah.
We weren't going to just invite 2 week hospitalizations back in our life if we could
Totally.
avoid that. And then the
Yeah.
tax that had on him physically. So for us, the clinical trials, what I learned is that exclusion criteria existed because they were trying to measure the side effects of the treatment they were studying in the clinical trial itself. And that disconnect, I think, illustrated to me, informed my opinion firsthand about the function of clinical trials in a large part. This is a generalization, of course. And it was an N of one because of our circumstance. But it revealed to me that the study is about learning what we can about the treatments in isolation, right? You have to be able to control variables that contribute to the outcomes. You can't have lots of other things in play as you're deploying a clinical trial because it makes your data
Right.
messy.
Right.
But when you're a patient in this experience, right? And you're like, I need access to something else, but I also can't discontinue these other things that are preserving my quality of life. You're now at an impasse. What do you do?
Hmm.
And so for us, we had to choose not to proceed with a clinical trial because we weren't willing to sacrifice and give up what life we had accessible to us with
Yeah.
having that, that therapeutic benefit from the medical cannabis available for him.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
struggled with that a little bit, right? Like how do you reconcile that when and you're like optimistic, there may be something new here, but we do inherently have to limit out of control for the study who does in fact have access to these things.
Yeah. I mean, and it is ultimately too one of the greatest challenges in doing research because as someone who
So
sits on the other
challenging.
side to do the recruitment, half the time, like I always joke, but it's not untrue that you're looking for someone who has stage 4 cancer, but is otherwise completely healthy, which is
Yeah.
just the definition of stage 4 is you have Mets, right? So you're probably gonna have unhealthy organ systems at some place in time.
Yeah.
And so it complicates the research, and also we have to be able to detect signal from noise, and it's really challenging, and part of me feels like, are there I think this is one of the the crux of the issue, right? And it's one thing if you're looking at new treatments for conditions that are already really well controlled to say, like, there are these good options, like, let me wash out and see if this new one has fewer side effects or if this new one is better. And it's a completely different ball game when, as is increasingly the case, you are having this be really your only real option. I think it
Yeah.
was like last year was what was it, like 50% of approvals were for rare diseases, I think, and we know that 5% of rare diseases have any type of treatment. I know childhood cancer is a completely different animal, and yet it is also technically a rare disease. I lump that in there. Um, and I think what's tricky too, and the difference in our stories too, is like I sit in the rare space, right? And rare, like
Mhm.
the research piece is really exciting because there are new cell and gene therapies coming in, da 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 da. And
Yeah.
childhood cancer is one of the most understudied conditions. We invest a lot in adult oncology, and then we see trials, either pediatric trials coming up at sort of the point of patent expiration, or we see data. Uh, we don't see as much research being done in childhood cancer, and I think part of the challenge with that is that as little humans are not just smaller humans. They have their
Mhm.
bodies function differently, and so like understanding how do these treatments that are being designed and tested in adults actually work in a pediatric setting. And yeah, I mean, I could go on about this for days and days, right? But it is this catch 22 of how do you get new treatments researched sufficiently that the data are clean enough that they can go for approval so that they are available, while also reconciling the fact that when a trial is your only treatment option, or it feels like maybe the only path forward, there are very real implications to your quality of life. And I do think about that with Rona too, right? Like she spent
Yeah.
the last 4.5 months of her life literally locked in a room, unable to leave for anything more fun than a CT scan.
Mm.
We faced delirium from being in the ICU as long as we were in there. I mean, it's social isolation was a big thing. You have kids who just want to be kids and run around, and you need them to do that in order to keep their lungs healthy. And yet you confine them to a space where they can't do that. And so you start to see that deterioration. And I think yeah, I think this is why quality of life comes up for me, right? Because at
Yeah.
some point there needs to be a responsibility to quality of life in a research setting when we are encouraging people to spend what can be their last weeks and months in there. In your case, that was access to a drug that really helped to control some, like THC. We used it too for appetite stimulation and mood control. But like it is access to something that is actually helping, that we know is helping, and also
Mm.
access to something that could potentially have
Yeah.
a better impact, and not just disregarding the fact that these are humans who want to have lives outside of the study. Yeah, I think this is a big black box question because where does the responsibility lie and who's responsible for enforcing that? And I think Sorry, I am on a
Yeah,
roll today.
go, go.
But
That is what we're here for. I
I
love it.
think
And
that
I love that we're
I
talking
think,
about
like
quality of life on a podcast that we clearly said is about death.
well, here's what I'm gonna tie it together
Ironic,
right
right?
now for everyone. Okay,
All right, take us
is that
home.
okay? It is that you have to go into a trial for a critical illness understanding that not everyone's gonna walk out of that hospital.
Yeah.
And you have to go into that understanding that even if they do walk out of the hospital, if your endpoint is 6 months of disease-free survival, they are giving you a gift of your time, of their precious opportunity to be with family and friends and doing other things that are important to them. So one, we need to stop acting like it's insane when people choose not to join clinical trials. There are very valid reasons that someone would not to. But two, we need to design things and we need to think about our systems in ways where we understand that death is a possible and likely outcome in many instances. And if we design from that place, I think if we design from that place and we access our own humanness and human nature, we can get to a place where we actually are enticing people to join research studies because we're not asking them to give up aspects of their time, their humanity, in ways that feel like it's diminishing what time they have left with um, on this earth.
Yeah.
Yeah,
This is where I get so nerdy and excited about
let's do
palliative
it.
care because,
Yes.
like, when I think about that clinical specialty and that function,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, they're prepared to handle that conversation. And they're equipped with the right resources and the right training to help coach a parent in that decision-making process of how do I
Totally.
figure out, I'm afraid of my child dying. Like, it's a very deep, real fear, and it's, like, core to our motherhood, our parenthood,
Yeah.
right? I don't want my child to die, and I'm facing something one option on my table in front of me is something that could help them. And in
Hmm.
some cases, maybe even curative, right?
Yeah.
But what's it going to cost me to go down that path? And what's it going to cost me? What assurances are there that life is possible beyond the immediate risk at hand, right?
Yeah.
Here's a reality, cold hard truth, every single one of us is going to die.
Yep.
At least in the current technology that we understand and all of that. That is a real thing. We do not avoid death.
We
We
never
adjust
will.
the timing of
We're
it,
never going
right?
to avoid it. We
We're
have to
never
walk
gonna
through
avoid
that
it.
doorway. Yeah.
Exactly. We all have to, whether it's 30, 50, 80 years from now, or if it's 2, right? Or if it's 6 months. So how do we make decisions around that very, very concrete reality? To your point at the start of this
Yeah.
conversation, right? Born, death, and taxes is what we are guaranteed in this lifetime. So why are we avoiding that variable that we have such a high level of confidence in favor of things that may allow us to avoid that reality, right? That's
Yeah.
inherently what we're doing.
Yeah.
And we're using rhetoric like that in some cases to also engage with patient populations. This is a real sobering comment industry.
Yeah.
That is what's happening in a lot of cases. Here, industry, I'm going to give you something that may extend that time.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to address the death part of that because that's super uncomfortable and no one wants to talk about it.
Yeah.
But this is where it has to come into strategy. The way we make decisions in the services we offer, in the products we design, and what
Yep.
we make available and accessible to certain patient populations or even caregivers themselves, we cannot avoid the reality that death exists. And we also can't avoid the reality of, let's say, I'm a huge, on a soapbox around caregiver well-being. There is some
Yeah.
research out there, you guys, that is very disturbing around caregiver well-being, not just quality of life, but actual mortality rates.
Yeah.
There was a research study done that just came out within the last few months that said the 5-year survival for a caregiver who is given 30 plus hours a week of caregiving services to a loved one. Crazy, you guys. It's like 60%. We would all be flipping out if that was a disease state outcome. And we are facing that. But we don't look at caregiving as this mortality risk and like a life extending risk because one, we don't measure it. We're not looking at caregiver well being as a
Yeah.
measurement of health outcomes or our performance and success clinically. And this is back to like where you can't absolve the whole human experience from the strategy because it's convenient or uncomfortable.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
have to face these things head on, and we have to build the strategies around that reality, and if we avoid doing so, they're not gonna work.
Well, I think too, like one of the things if we're talking about scientific validity, right, is one of the things we're trying to control for when we say with our inclusion and exclusion criteria, i.e., you can't take THC because it could potentially give you a different outcome than someone else, and therefore it complicates our analysis.
Yep.
Is that if we were to just level set that everyone gets access to certain things, i.e., it is a critical or life limiting illness, terminal illness, and we say everyone gets access to palliative care. Now we know from research that palliative care not only improves caregiver outcomes, because that is a very real thing, it
Yep.
not only improves perceptions of quality of life and care, but also it extends life. So there's a seminal research study from 2010 that individuals with advanced lung cancer who got access to early palliative care early in their journey lived 3 months longer than individuals who did not. Um, but then you know what you're controlling for. You don't even
Yeah.
have to control for it because every person got access to that service. So there
Yeah.
are things we can do to improve the patient experience while also still controlling for and reaching our outcomes and being able to measure true effect size. Because if there is a placebo effect of access to that, it's going to be the same across both cohorts. As
Mhm.
long as it's in the protocol and so therefore it is standardized. So this is like part of my push is how can we push on research to think about how we might embed some of these things into the protocol so that it is structured and it is then not affecting the outcome, but then still giving access to it. But your point on caregiver, I mean, I have had so many people who are like, so do you have like any ache and pain you need to get thee to a doctor? And, like cardiovascular disease. I remember last year when I was coming down, sort of that first year, I was, like, in this heightened, like, state, and then I never got sick, and then last year, it was just this, like, nonstop parade of viral infections.
Mhm.
I got really sick for a while, when that nervous system was coming back down again, and it
Yeah.
took I'm almost at 3 years now. It'll be 3 years in September, and it took, like, 2.5 years to start to get back to this steady state, but um, I have a friend I was talking to this weekend who also lost a child um decades ago and who's having now health issues related to that because she wasn't able to stop and slow down and kind of deal with that because she had other children to be taken care of and um
Mhm.
that caregiver piece it's a tough one to navigate, and also, like, for pediatric research, critical, and also for adult research in a lot of cases, if we're looking at, like, dementia or Alzheimer's, do you have a
Yeah.
caregiver aspect and caregiver burden to that too?
Well, and
That
that's something
sandwich
we're gonna absolutely have to face, I mean, as a
Yeah,
society, this is gonna become so unavoidable for us. I mean,
totally.
this is just back to we can't control the fact that death is going to happen at some point.
Yeah,
And especially with an aging population, we
yeah,
normalizing that conversation I think also kinda takes the fear out of it a little bit, right?
yeah,
Like, these are real things, and it's not something necessarily to be afraid of, and it's
yeah,
actually when you remove the fear from the room and you say, "Okay, fear, you're out, like, we've accepted what we're facing, let's make the most out of it." Holy smokes, what a life lesson in there too. I mean, when we found out what we were facing, I mean, we always kept hope, we always kept optimism as much as we could, and it was a grounded optimism. It wasn't blind. We weren't avoiding that
uh-huh,
reality. But we said, "You know what? If we're gonna face this, we need to make the most out of this time. And
totally.
we're gonna take all of our energy that we would have like kind of put towards a fight and fight for quality of life for our family. And we're gonna live
Yep,
as much and as big as we're physically capable of."
yep,
And I can say as somebody on the other side of that, now I'm 1 year out, I'm sure I have a long way to go in terms of where I'm at now from where you're at now, Lindsay, but
not necessarily.
yeah, I mean, it's wild, right? And I think on the other side of it, the gift that I'm so grateful for us that we did, that we learned in our process is that we had no regrets. We did everything we could with what we had, and we don't have any
Yeah,
regrets about where we landed with that. And I think there's
yeah,
a leadership lesson in there too, right? As a leader, as somebody who's
yeah,
who's leading a company or leading an organization or leading a trial or leading, any function of leadership. if you can make decisions so that you're not regretting or making or having regrets on that decision making,
Yeah.
I think that should be a goal, right? How can you do what you need to do and not feel like you didn't do what you could have done or regretted doing something in that process and that
Yeah.
decision making, even if it's the harder decisions to make in some cases?
Yeah. 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 There's the decision piece is like one that I think I'm just starting to grapple with. So you said like you're in a different place. We are in different places just inherently. We're going to be in different places,
Yeah.
but also like that doesn't mean that one is further ahead because the waves you talked about, like that's my metaphor for grief. I think it is a common metaphor. It's just like they come in waves, and it's
We're
like
both in the ocean. We both have waves coming at
we're
us.
in the deep end,
Yeah.
or maybe we're like right at that break where it hits
Yeah.
ground for the first time.
Yeah.
Um, I think like there's this element of from me that has come up this year around choices and the choices that we made as part of treatment and um the choices that I think I thought were choices but actually weren't,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um and you're choosing between two horrible things. You're not necessarily choosing between like a great thing and a less great thing. Um so I think we do make decisions and we make choices in care and healthcare. I think the move to shared decision making is one that is important, but also I don't know that we've created the infrastructure in our healthcare system to really support that and to support the implications of that, of feeling you want to have choice in your care. And also, you then carry part of the burden of having made the choice if the choice doesn't work out. And there's like
Yeah.
a thing here that I don't think we have enough time today to explore, but like, that is a thing too.
Well, it's
So
kinda
ethic
back to your
yeah.
comment about the informed consent, right? Like, we give the illusion candidly, there's an illusion that we present that there is a choice being had, but really, is there? No. I mean, informed consent in a lot of ways, infrastructure-wise, is delivered in a way that the autonomy or agency of the person signing that document really is, in fact, not there.
Well, I think that is like the moment where the protocol takes over. And so
Yeah.
to the point of an ICF, you are having choices. You can choose to be in the study, you can choose not to be in the study. I did withdraw us from one study at one point in time. Like I said, I withdraw consent, and it was because we needed a pathway to get her onto a different one. So like
Yeah.
there you have some choice within there. But once you've signed on to a protocol, the protocol is what is driving because that is kind of what it has to be. Um now again, like we had nuances in our care where there were certain deviations they could make that wouldn't jeopardize the data, and so that was what happened. Um, but yeah, if you're choosing to be on a study, the protocol is ultimately what is guiding that. And so for me, the conversation is less about, and we have a couple of questions. I'll touch on one right now. Like the comment is, it bothers me that ICFs are so long. Um, I actually think it's not about length. I think it's about clarity. And I don't think we
Mhm.
have a length problem. I think we have a clarity problem. And so really the ICF should be about understanding and ensuring understanding what's coming. And it is treated like a legal, this might happen and this might happen and this might happen. And these might be the potential benefits. And if this happens, da 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 da. But really it's like what is the implication of that for me? When I'm in a
Mhm.
moment of high stress, when I haven't slept for 4 months and for more than 15 minutes at a time, and my cognitive abilities are not where they should be, what do I need to understand about this? And how are you gonna help me in that moment go back to understanding what happened? Because, like, I cannot log into my chart to this day. I had a bad experience with it early on in our diagnostic journey. It is a trigger for me when someone's like, "Log into your EHR." I'm like, "No, thank you. You can call me." Um Still, I felt that way about the ICF. I could not go back and review what was in the ICF. I needed someone to explain it to me, and there were just certain things that I couldn't do that I still can't do. I was working on a speech and I dug it up to see how many pages there were, and like it took me a weekend to recover. So it's just
Yeah.
like it's not something I'm going to do again.
I
But
had a
yeah,
I had an example too that, I was just working through yesterday on some, like, ideas I've been ruminating on, and one of the examples was and to your point, was handling a phone tree. Like, when you're a caregiver and or parent in this case, right? In our
Yep.
circumstance. In one instance, my son had some vomiting episode at our
Yes.
house, no fever. We were worried about tumor progression or
Yeah.
recurrence. We hadn't had that confirmed at that point, but he also had this history of cyclic vomiting syndrome.
Yeah.
And then also just was a kid, right? So he would randomly get a GI bug like any other kid would get. And
Mm.
so you're at this crossroads in decision making as a parent, and you're like, I don't want to ignore something that could be really serious. But I also don't want to overreact if this is something as simple as just an average
Yeah.
kindergarten GI
Yeah.
bug, right? And, of course your child has like nuance and you have to take things more seriously just because of the circumstances around their own health and well-being. So that's,
Yeah.
you can measure that and contribute that in your decision making. But something as functional as getting connected with a oncology nurse in that moment, in that decision making.
Mhm.
So in our case, I would have to call the clinic, which would then have a phone tree that I would have to auditorily process when I called. I can't tell you how many times I would pick up that phone and just eventually hang up because I couldn't process the numbers that were being read to me and which one I needed to press.
I just
I know
hit
that sounds
0.
crazy, right? You're like 0, right? Just give me a
Just
0
like,
because
give me a person. Give me a
I don't know
person.
which one I need to
Yeah.
select, right? Just
Yeah.
give me a person that can help support my
Yeah.
decision-making process in this moment because I don't have access to those other abilities right now. In the state of my mind, it's afraid, it's hypervigilant. I don't have the ability to even literally hear a number and follow an instruction.
Yeah.
And I know that sounds crazy probably to some folks who maybe aren't having to deal with acute stress at that level on a regular basis, but this is a very real experience for a lot of parents
Yeah.
in these circumstances that are having to make decisions like this that can have major consequence, and they're the ones taking on the burden of that. And it's not just the emotional burden, which is a par for the course of being a parent, but there's an administrative burden now that they are accountable to.
Yeah.
That back to whose responsibility is this? And I think as an industry, if we move closer to a world that's measuring on outcomes, right? This value-based care model that we all keep talking about, talking circles around. I mean, I know there's initiatives and things that are measuring things in that direction, but like truly not a fee for service infrastructure, but one that is truly value-based care. And we're measuring on that. We can't ignore that reality because
Yes.
that reality of that parent and the decision making absolutely contributes to the health outcomes that are ultimately experienced by the
Yeah.
patient.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's happening. We just
Yeah.
maybe aren't measuring it and articulating it in the way today or yet that can help us really build that into a strategy. But this is back to, embracing death as a strategic data input, as an executive, as somebody who's leading a health system, leading a company that's responsible for these things. There are elements of responsibility that you can meaningfully augment that patient and caregiver experience with that reduce the burden and suffering on them that can, in fact, connect to better health outcomes.
Mhm.
There is opportunity there, and we can get really creative about how we tackle that, but we can't ignore that fact. And we've ignored it up until this date because it was too hard, but it's no longer too hard. We can do this now.
Well, that is actually a perfect note to end on, and we are at time. So,
Yes.
thanks. There's been a lot of engagement today. Thank you all so much for commenting. I know the link is showing up on my LinkedIn and for some reason not on the live stream. So, listen, next time we'll figure out our tech. We had some
Yeah.
issues last time, some issues this time. But we really appreciate everyone who's listening and engaging. And Erica, just thank you for joining me and sharing the space. I was like, are you sure you want to do this today? But I feel just so honored that you shared a little bit of your day today with me and a little bit of August and his journey. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you for being gentle too and understanding with the tech issues. That said, I'm laughing, you guys. I'm laughing because I feel like my son's just messing with me today. And
Oh,
he's like, hey,
totally.
mom, I'm here.
100%.
I'm going to mess with your computer. I'm going to mess with this little alarm in your kitchen while you're trying to
Yes.
have coffee this morning. And, um, I think maybe one other, final comment. There's so much, you guys, that we don't know. Whether you're spiritual, whether you're, whatever you are, wherever you exist in your belief system, this is back to what we measure, right? There's so much we don't measure that's real.
Yeah.
That is a truth. And so maybe, I just want to leave everybody with, perhaps it's a little bit of optimism today too, that like there is a world and a reality that exists beyond what we perceive on a day-to-day basis that is as real as everything else that we experience. And so keep those possibilities open and keep your mind open to receiving things and perceiving the world in which it may exist that is filtered through our own individual reality. And this is very metaphysical. But these things contribute to how we make decisions. So keep your mind open because the possibilities for us as we look at the industry going forward exist in that capacity. They exist in that reality that there's so much more that we can comprehend. And so that's really the context in which we're operating. It's not the filter that each one of us has individually. And if we keep our minds open and keep open to those possibilities, there are things and opportunities that can come from that perspective that can be truly transformative for this industry and help really bring health outcomes better to patients and caregivers that they deserve. So on that note, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the stories we tell ourselves, and when the story breaks. When the
Yeah.
story of the guarantee that you go to school, you get married, you have a kid, and you outlive them breaks, it lets other things break too, and other assumptions break. So not just the guarantees in life, but the limiting beliefs that we have. So I always say, like, there is an after, and what do you want the after to look like? Very much.
Well,
Nothing brings out the metaphysical in you like losing a child. I think that's like the
yeah.
most common theme I hear. So,
Yeah. A bunch of
um,
hippies over here. A bunch of crunchy hippies.
maybe it's why I always say it's not the club you want to join, but it's full of the best people, and that might be why. 'Cause
Yeah, I think
just
so. I think
yeah.
so. All right.
Okay, well, that's the perfect note to end
Yeah,
on,
there we go. I
obviously.
love it. Thanks everybody
Um,
for joining us. Thanks for the engagement, and we
yeah,
will see you next month for
yeah.
a great conversation.
Thanks. Bye.